It is with great pleasure that I am introducing Sandra Gilman today. Not only did Sandra present the first year of CRASSH's birth, and since we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of CRASSH, I didn't even know when I thought of Sandra, Ariane and I thought of Sandra, but Sandra did tell us that it would be totally serendipitous for him to be present here today, since he had been there at the beginning. For those of you who are not familiar with Sandra's work, a brief bio before we begin. He's a distinguished professor of the liberal arts and sciences, as well as professor of psychiatry at Emory University. A cultural and literary historian. He is the author of Making the Body Beautiful, A Cultural History of Aesthetic Surgery, published at Princeton University Press. There's also another book, Are Racists Crazy? ? How Prejudice, Racism, and Anti-Semitism Became Markers of Insanity at Milieu Press, Seeing the Insane at the University of Nebraska Press. These are just some of Sandra Gilman's oeuvre. For 25 years, he was a member of the Humanities and Medical faculties at Cornell University, where he held the Goldman Smith Professorship of Humane Studies. For 6 years, he held the Henry R. Luce Distinguished Service Professorship of the Liberal Arts in Human Biology at the University of Chicago. For 4 years, he was a distinguished professor of the liberal arts and medicine at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where he created the Humanities Laboratory. He has been a visiting professor at numerous universities in North America, South Africa, the United Kingdom, Germany, Israel, China, and New Zealand. He was the president of the Modern Language Association in '95, and he has been awarded a Doctor of Laws, honoris causa, at the University of Toronto, elected an honorary professor at the Free University or the Freie Universität in Berlin, made an honorary member of the American Psychoanalytic Association, and made a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So it is with great pleasure that we have you speaking with us today. The floor is yours.
First, let me thank the organizers for this extraordinary conference. The advantage of a Zoom access means that one can both attend and not attend simultaneously. It's been an extraordinary couple of days, and I thank you. A long time ago, in a galaxy very, very far away, we used to speak about meta-narratives. Remember meta-narratives? These were the kind of tales that we told that made sense of the past, but also explained how the past related to the present. These narratives, as we well know, were wish fulfillments. But one of the things that they did do, which we now recognize in the 21st century, is that they were able to encapsulate emotions. With the work of Sarah Ahmed and Laura Otis, we've become more and more aware that narrative structures, in point of fact, are simultaneously and maybe even primarily affective structures. One of the things that my colleague Joe Shun and I have done in our recent I Know Who Caused COVID-19, Pandemics and Xenophobia, which appeared now almost 3 weeks ago, and of course is completely out of date, is to look at the narratives about plague, and very specifically how the narratives about plague allow us to think about COVID-19. So what I'm going to do today is actually quite simple. Our book stops in January of 2021 with Joe Biden becoming president of the United States. An arbitrary date, but you had to stop someplace. As I say, the book appeared in September. I want to do catch up. I want to talk a little bit about meta-narratives about plague, and then I want to talk about what's happened with Delta as a way of extending our discussion about emotions, about affect and disease, right? So let us start with the first, and I'm going to make an argument, the most important meta-narrative, a text which gives us the meta-narrative for plague and politics. And that's, of course, Thucydides in his history of the Peloponnesian War. Now, Thucydides is a person who is very careful in what he claims. And we always have to listen to his language. When he talks about the plague, he talks about the plague from a first-hand point of view. He says, I shall describe its course, explain the symptoms, because I was sick of the disease myself. I saw others be sick. Empirical, I was there. You can trust me. But also, he wants to understand, and this is central to all narratives about infectious diseases, where did the plague come from? Who caused the plague? And he is very careful to say, hey, look, you guys, you Hicks and Piraeus, you thought the Peloponnesians had snuck in and poisoned your wells. Millennium before the Jews are poisoning the wells in Strasbourg during the Black Plague. You thought they were poisoning your wells. I know better. And he writes a sentence which is really important. You have to listen to it. The disease began, it is said, in Ethiopia beyond Egypt, and then descended into Egypt and Libya and spread over the greater part of the king's territory. The disease began, they claim. Someone on the internet states they know where it started. And it started among them, the Ethiopians. Now, plague is always political. The public health is always political by definition. And so it isn't terribly surprising that the leader of Athens, Pericles, who has now gotten enormous amounts of reaction to the fact that this is the second war with the Peloponnesians and the chaos that results from the plague, right? It's just chronic problems, stands up and says, you have to bear the resignations, the affliction sent by heaven, he says. But we, he says, we want MAGA. We want to make Athens great again. They caused it, it is said, but we are going to make Athens great again. Thucydides was convinced, by the way, that government basically is ruled by entropy. That is, you have a strong leader like Pericles, he maybe controls the chaos after the plague. He may right the society, but at some point the society will collapse into entropy again. I said that the Thucydidean account of the plague is, and it's really important to understand, the central meta-narrative for plague in the West. If we move to the 17th century, the next great age of plague in the early modern age, or maybe we won't even call it the modern age, Thucydides is translated into English in 1629 by Thomas Hobbes in the age of his plague. Hobbes' Leviathan, that text which describes our lives as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, Hobbes's life is determined by plague. Abraham Bossi recognized this. If you look at the frontispiece of Leviathan, the largest image is an abandoned city street. And two people are walking in this city street wearing what else but 17th century PPE? They're plague doctors, right? Hobbes goes through Thucydides one better. He says that the individual must more or less voluntarily submit to the state, to the terror of what he calls the public sword, to avoid the chaos that is not the result of any specific action, such as plague, the plague that he's experienced, but human nature. So he goes through Thucydides one better. Thus, Hobbes condemns liberty, freedom from the unfettered actions of human beings living in what he imagined to be a state of nature. True freedom for Hobbes demands in the end an accountability to the collective, freedom limited in order to substantially protect those in your world from harm, if at all possible. Because liberty, freedom from, according to Hobbes, creates a world where there is, and I'm quoting him, perpetual war of every man against his neighbor, no inheritance to transmit to the son, nor to expect from the father, no proprietary of goods or lands, no security. That is the world, of course, of plague. It is the Athenian plague. It is Hobbes's plague of the 17th century. But who's at fault? The Ethiopians were at fault, right? It is said. Now, what happens with the Great Plague in the 17th century is, for me, interesting. What happens is that it happens simultaneously, like the Peloponnesian War, with the Great Fire. And we know who caused the Great Fire because we've read Pepys, the Catholics, of course. But who caused the plague? The plague, according to Parliament, was an act of God. According to Pericles, it was an act of God, right? And then Parliament starts to ask the question, and God bless Hazard, because we have these discussions. Why was God unhappy with the English? And that's because of the rejection of God's law by atheists like Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes, it is said, caused the Great Plague. Now, one of the things that interests me and interested Joe Shun in writing our book was not only who gets blamed, but how they react to getting blamed. This is an ongoing problem. Hobbes' reaction, by the way, is to as quickly as possible burn all his papers. He's no fool. His experience already in British intellectual life had shown how unstable the public intellectual really was. And Leviathan, in point of fact, grows out of the experience of plague, but also of being blamed for plague. Now, by the 18th century, certainly in England, there is an understanding that the state has an obligation in times of plague. And this goes back to the 1603 plague law of James I. Now, something happens in the 18th century, which we really do have to understand, which is that Sir William Blackstone writes a common law for idiots. It is a summary of common law. And when people in the 18th and 19th century talk about common law, they're not talking about common law. They're talking about common law for idiots, Blackstone's summary of common law. And he summarizes and stresses the fear of the public sword, Hobbes in terms of plague. And he says, quoting the law of James I, that people who are infected with plague, they've got to follow the rules. They've got to undertake quarantine. But he says, if someone is commanded to quarantine, and this will resonate on all of us who have spent the last 2 years almost now in lockdown, even if he is commanded to confine himself to go and goes abroad and converses in company, even if he has no plague upon him, he shall be punished as a vagabond by whipping and be bound to his good behavior. If he is infected, he shall be guilty of a felony. Right? Blackstone is aware that state interventions, quarantine, which has, as you well know, a very, very, very long history in the West, that state interventions can never be foolproof against plague. This is well in advance of germ theory, obviously, but that the absence of any enforceable state or collective actions almost guarantees its spread. Miasma theory, use whatever theory you want. They are quite aware that plague spreads, right? Now, as I said, Blackstone is common law for idiots. All of the founding fathers of the United States who were lawyers, such as Thomas Jefferson, read Blackstone. And Jefferson is, from our perspective, of course, a Lockean. And by the way, we've just learned, because this was the big debate, because Locke never acknowledges his debt to Hobbes, that Locke literally had on his bedside reading table his own annotated copy of Locke's. Individual liberty, according to John Locke, is in point of an answer to what? The terror of the sword, right? That Hobbes advocates coming out of his understanding of plague. And Thomas Jefferson, in the Declaration of Independence, speaks that about certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What Blackstone writes is that the absolute rights of the individual and the state were personal security that assures the enjoyment of life and health. Life and health. Locke opens the door to discussions of freedom too, that had been closed by Hobbes in his discussions of freedom from. And that's really important, because American constitutional law is, in point of fact, and I have to stress this, American constitutional law in regard to quarantine and to public health measures until the present moment, and the new right-wing court has been Hobbesian and not Lockean, right? Now, when we start to talk about the state, right, and the public's health, we have to understand that the boundaries of the state are imagined boundaries. Everything that I've talked about with Thucydides, with Hobbes, with Blackstone, imagine a state. Now, my old friend and colleague, the late Ben Anderson in Imagined Communities, argued that once you got to the size of the national state, once you abandoned a kind of religious definition of the state, and by the way, he's right, of course, in terms of Western Europe, but the truth is that the imagined community exists in Athens, and it exists in Elizabethan England, as well as in the post-Enlightenment colonial epic. Now, what he says, and what Ben Anderson says, is what bounds people in a state is this symbolic register. And the symbolic register, he said, always has to be kind of natural. That's the word he used. Something unchosen, he says. Nationness is assimilated, he says, to skin color, gender, parentage, birth era, things we cannot help. But we know, of course, that all of those categories are narrative categories, so the way we talk about ourselves, right? Skin color, gender, parentage, birth era, are real in that they have symbolic value. These natural ties, and he goes back, of course, to Max Weber. These natural ties define what Weber calls the beauty of Gemeinschaft. I'm going to add, and I think it's really important, to this notion that these are symbolic communities, right? Communities defined by a symbolic register, health. Communities define themselves as healthy, and illness, especially infectious illness, is always defined as outside of the community. And you understand that how flexible the notion of the imagined community can be. Public health doesn't quite get it. It's been a real problem in public health discussions of COVID-19, because public health uses a late 19th, early 20th century statistical concept, the population. The population, of course, is statistical. It's defined by what? Some common, single, or multiple denominator that binds a group. In point of fact, COVID affects communities, that is, groups that are defined symbolically, and symbolically by things that tie them together, one of which is always the notion of health, a healthy community. Now, I've been writing about pandemics since HIV/AIDS, and my colleague at Northwestern, Mary Douglas, in The Age of HIV, noted that the fear of danger, and I'm quoting her, tends to strengthen the lines of division in a community, right? I think that's absolutely true. If that is so, the response to a major crisis digs more deeply the cleavages that have been there all the time. And I'm going to argue that cleavages within the community reveal that within the so-called community, there are communities that are symbolically defined. If there is violent xenophobia, she says, the foreigners will be blamed and pogromed more. Now, what Joe Shun and I ask in our book, which is what happens, and it's a real problem with COVID-19, when stereotypes are evoked to blame the outsider, the person belonging now to a group beyond the community. It is said that the Ethiopians caused the plague, but when they are actually either individually or collectively really at fault. So we looked at a number of case studies. We looked at what happened in China following Wuhan, and how the PRC looked to blame other people, starting, by the way, with Africans and African immigrants, the Ethiopians, right, in Gwangju, through to American frozen food, through to whatever they're going to blame next week. And how that notion of blame is echoed then elsewhere in the world by attacks on Asians, not Chinese, because the category of Asians is a global one. As Ben Anderson said, skin color defines community, right? It's symbolic for a community. And then how these communities respond. So we looked at the Chinese. We looked at ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel, the United Kingdom, and the United States, who had a much higher rate of morbidity and mortality, and who spread the virus in their communities and beyond their communities. We looked at African Americans, and I'm going to talk more about that today, and BAME communities in the UK. We looked at the right wing, and we defined them in terms of white nationalists, but of course, there are ultra-Orthodox Jews, there are African Americans, they are, and I'm going to use this as a kind of shorthand, the Trumpites. And then we took a look at how all of these discussions about blaming, when you are blamed, reflect the anxiety and fear, not so much of COVID, though that plays a role, but the anxiety of blame, right? That's really central to our argument. Now, I've been speaking about freedom from, and those of you who know that phrase, the notion of negative freedom, know that it's Isaiah Berlin's, the famous two concepts of liberty, his attempt to kind of bring in the 1950s, in the age of the Cold War, it's really important, Hobbes, Blackstone, and Thucydides, of course, kind of up to date. And what he asks is not only what it means to be controlled, but who does the controlling, right? And that's been a real problem, because everything that I'm going to be talking about, all of the interventions that I'm talking about, which may have positive public health effects, have been used. They were used in Athens, they were used in London, also as means of social control for other reasons than the pandemic, right? Again, look at COVID-19 control in Hong Kong, if you want to see the best possible example. Now, as I said, we stopped our book in January 20th, 2021, with Joe Biden becoming president of the United States. After, by the way, the first major political violent insurrection in American history in regard to the peaceful transfer of power. It's the first time it had ever happened. Didn't happen with George Washington. It didn't happen with Abraham Lincoln. It did happen with Donald Trump. All right. So what I want to do over the next 15 to 20 minutes is to basically talk about what's happened with Delta, what's happened since January 20th with the introduction of the vaccines, which started in December, but really only had an impact, a public impact, after January 20th. And I want to look at what happened on both the right and the left. Now, these are not coherent categories, right? And how you orient yourself is very complicated in the United States. But I'm going to use these because I'm looking at public sphere and discussions in the public sphere. I want to start with the left. We finally, in the spring of 2020, my wife and I decided we were going to have holiday, as we were doing for 40 years before, with the exception of the year before, on Cape Cod. We live in Washington, D.C. This was a discussion in April, May, and we looked at the rapid decline of infection rates, the rapid decline of morbidity and mortality, at the spike in vaccination, extraordinary spike in vaccinations, especially in the state of Massachusetts. And we girded our loins, as the King James Version says, and we decided to rent for a couple of weeks on the Cape. We got in our car, sealed the car, packed our lunches, and drove up to Cape Cod. the end of July. As we drove towards Cape Cod, we kept on hearing that the numbers in Cape Cod were getting simultaneously worse. They started at 0 on the 3rd of July. We said, sitting in Washington, we can drive up. There are no cases in Barnstable County, which is where we're going to be, the tip of Cape Cod. By the middle of the month, there are 200 cases. On the 4th of July, right, the great American holiday, in Provincetown, Massachusetts, which is the West Coast San Francisco, the gay capital of Eastern United States, 60,000 people showed up to fill the clubs in a town of about 3,000 people. The result of that influx of 60,000 people, heavily vaccinated, was an inordinate spike, almost 900 cases in Barnstable County by the time we got there. Why? Well, the CDC says, you know, you really got to, and this was in the weekly statement, which gave us the numbers, you really got to, whether you're vaccinated or not, mask in indoor settings, keep distance, right? Be aware that the virus can be transmitted by asymptomatic people. We talk about breakthrough infections, but no vaccine is 100% until you've got the entire population controlled. Think of smallpox, right? Now, one of the things that one has to understand is that this is a liberal crowd, right? This is a group of people who got vaccinated. It wasn't like this was a group of vaccine deniers. But they had an interesting problem. The left has an interesting problem. And this was already foreshadowed in January as the vaccines are starting to get rolled out by Mohammed Morshed at the University of British Columbia, who writes an editorial called "The COVID-19 Vaccines, a Magic Bullet." And he ends the vaccine, the editorial, I'll read it from it. Would this vaccine, because it's not there yet, right? Would this vaccine be a magic bullet? No, he says. As much as the recent positive news gives us reason to hope for a more normal future, we need to adhere to public health guidance, such as mask wearing, hand washing, physical distancing where possible, and to avoid what is now called super spreader events, whether you're vaccinated or not. So what the left does is what Anna Freud calls intellectualization. We are vaccinated, they say. We are young. We are beautiful. We are going to party, party, party. Now, that is, in point of fact, a form of ego defense. It is not irrational, because we always want to make sure that our ego is defended. But it is, in point of fact, not a good way to deal with a world filled with things we cannot see, which may impact us, and through our actions, impact other people. So the people who are vaxxers intellectualize. The real problem, of course, in the United States was not the outbreaks, for example, in Provincetown, that was bad enough, but the extraordinary collapse of the health systems in what I will call the red states, the states that voted for Donald Trump, the states that did what? Refuse not only the mandates for the use of masking, not only the mandates eventually for the use of vaccines, but downplayed over and over again the risk to any given individual because of the demand for, it is stated, it is said, right, economic solidarity. By the way, which does not result from massive infections, from the collapse of health systems. And so what happens, and this is really important, that the debates in the United States wind up being a debate about, on the right, about freedom. And that's why I started with Thucydides, and I talked about Hobbes, and I talked about Blackstone, and I talked about Isaiah Berlin. In 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, again, my old colleague, Cass Sunstein, who is now at Harvard, wrote a book with Adrian Vermeule called Law and Leviathan, looking at the morality of administrative law. And he, by the way, he's not a fool. They're not fools. He understands, Pache, Isaiah Berlin, that it's important to look at the state that's making and using the laws, right? They say that, look, the Nazi state was not a legitimate state, and therefore administrative law in the Nazi state had no legitimate functions. But he said, they say in their introduction, those who support the administrative state deny that it is a threat to liberty, properly understood. Consider some of the actual activities of that state. Would people be freer without child labor laws, without protection against pandemics? You know, that's actually what, in both cases, by the way, the desire to get rid of child labor laws and to get rid of any protection against COVID-19 became the mantra of Republican governors following Trump, right? Individual liberty, now in the Jeffersonian sense, is more important than individual safety in the Hobbesian sense. Now, the right, from the very beginning of COVID, labeled themselves as the victims. All social control, they said, aims at controlling us as individuals and as a community, because we define ourselves in terms of our freedom, right? We define ourselves in terms of our freedom, but our freedom, it is implied, guarantees our health. So there is, of course, this huge explosion of conspiracies, right? First of all, it's not bad, right? It's just like the flu. It's just like the flu. We survived the flu. Our freedom to do what we want in the flu, and we survived the flu, except for those, of course, who died in the flu. It's the doc's fault. They're getting extra money when they diagnose COVID. Most of the people who are diagnosed with COVID, they're not even sick at all. You know, but if they are sick, they're going to be treated with drugs, and the pharmaceutical companies are making a buck because they're not letting us use those drugs that are basically generic and cheap, like chloroquine, an anti-malarial, or ivermectin, an anti-worming agent. It's a cabal, they say. We know what's causing. We know, it is said, we know what is causing COVID-19. It's 5G and Bill Gates making a but who really is at fault? Who is at fault for this state control, this terror of the sword that impacts on our freedom? Who demands masks and distance and limitation of access and demands that we get vaccine? It's all George Soros and the Jews, they said. Let me quote Glenn Beck, because part of the way that they do this, which is why I begin with Thucydides, is to instrumentalize history, right? is to instrumentalize history. Glenn Beck, who's a right-wing TV commentator in the United States, says, I've done my homework. Now they're rounding up another group of people and being pointed at, we on the right wing, and are called morons and idiots and crackpots and crazies. Where is anybody today saying, my gosh, we're living in the days of Galileo? The church has become the state, he says. And if you don't practice their religion exactly the way they tell you to, you're done. I am Galileo fighting against the church, he says. Now, that instrumentalization of history happens in an other way, and we talk about it in great deal in our discussion of African Americans. And by the way, it also impacts in Great Britain. So I'm going to talk about African Americans, but the discourse is also present bizarrely in Great Britain. Because one of the things that happens very, very early on is that it is clear that people of color are being impacted to a much greater extent than anybody else in American society, and African Americans more than any other groups of people of color. The result is the result of a whole concatenation of problems, which I'm going to summarize as systemic racism. The jobs that people have, the fact that these jobs have to continue, the living conditions that people have, where they're living, how they're living, most importantly, access to healthcare in the United States. But what happens very early on to try to understand what could potentially be an anxiety in the African American community is to point at the history of mistreatment, the correct, accurate history of the mistreatment of African Americans in allopathic medicine in the United States. They point to Jane Marion Sims' abuse of female slaves in his gynecological research. They point to the case of Henrietta Lacks, the HeLa cells, which you all know about, which was taken from her and still used by Hopkins researchers in the 50s. But most importantly, they talk about the Tuskegee experiment, the experiment on syphilis, which continued from the 30s to the 70s, even after a specific antibiotics, penicillin, was developed to treat tertiary syphilis. Now, one of the things we have to say is these are all true. But the real problem, right, the real problem in 2021 is not the history of the treatment of African Americans by allopathic medicine, but the access of allopathic medicine by African Americans, right? This becomes a kind of a theme. Barack Obama says that in an interview in December, right before the vaccines are available, I understand historically everything dating back all the way to the Tuskegee experiments, why the African community would have some skepticism about vaccines. Now, the reality is, and again, we lived this in Washington, when the vaccine was made available in the District of Columbia, it was made available district-wide. This is January and February of 2021. I live in Ward 3. Ward 3 is upper middle class and very white. I live in a very white upper middle class apartment building. I noticed that while I was standing in line at my hospital to get an appointment to get the vaccine, which I only got, by the way, the end of March, and therefore March, April, I got the 2 shots. My neighbors were getting shots immediately. How were they doing it? They were going on their computer, they're going on their iPad, they're going on their iPhone. They were making appointments in the predominantly Black wards, right? And they got in their cars and they drove to the Black wards and they got their shots. Because people in the Black wards did not have easy access to Wi-Fi, to computers, and because public transportation had basically stopped in the district. By the way, very quickly, the district started to make the vaccine available only by wards. So it was an economic fault line that was being exposed, and that became very obvious. Yes, there is vaccine hesitancy, but vaccine hesitancy among the African American community is no worse than the white community in which it is embedded. It's a very interesting point. But what interested me and Joe Shun in writing our book was that bizarrely, and I really say bizarrely, African Americans were never blamed for spreading COVID-19. They were most at risk. They were most in the hospital. They were dying most from it. But nobody in the public sphere pointed at them. It is only after Delta, and that's really important, only in the late summer of 2021, when the red states, the Trump states, begin to have a spike of Delta infections among people who are not vaccinated, who are young, and who are now being hospitalized at greater numbers than in the original outbreak. Really important to understand. This is not merely a spike, but a greater spike than a year earlier. Okay? That all of a sudden, the right wing discovers who is at fault. Not we who are rejecting the vaccine, not we who have said that it's the conspiracy, not we who says, in point of fact, that we are victims of the state, but they are at fault. Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, who, by the way, in the last spike said, old people should die so that my grandchildren, he said, have an economic stability. Old people died and their grandchildren, his grandchildren, did not have economic stability. Was interviewed and he said, and I want to quote this because it's an important thing to quote. Democrats like to blame Republicans on that. Well, the biggest group in most states are African Americans who have not been vaccinated. The last time I checked, over 90% of them vote for Democrats in their major cities and major counties. Now, the reality, of course, is that Black vaccination rates in Texas mimic overall vaccination rates, and that's pretty much the case. But it doesn't break down in terms of real numbers. The real numbers of infections, in point of fact, with Delta in the red states have been the unvaccinated, and they are what? Overwhelmingly white Republicans. So all of a sudden, what we're starting to see is that Black residents in Texas, who are about 12% of the state's population, are having about 12% of the cases that have been diagnosed. The greater majority of cases in Texas are among non-Blacks and non-Hispanics. Now, I want to end with that because this question always is, who gets blamed when I get blamed? Because when we start to look at plague, when we start to look at epidemic and pandemic, one of the real questions, and this was true with HIV/AIDS, it was true with SARS, it was true with H1N1, it was true with mad cow disease, is when I get blamed, whom do I blame? How does that enable communities, imagined communities, symbolic communities, to maintain their integrity, because it enables the individuals in those communities to maintain their ego coherence? That, I think, is the central message that Joe Shun and I want to transmit in our book. And it's a problem, I think, that has been understudied because looking at stereotypes does not look at the function of stereotypes in the group's stereotypes. I'm going to end at that point, and I want to thank again the organizers and potentially the panelists for their attention.
Thank you so much for that, Sander. Ariane and I are thrilled that to have read your, to have listened and seen your presentation.